Hey YouTube, this is Lithium017 bringing you my review of the Horipad Mini 64 controller. This controller is a Japanese exclusive release controller that was released somewhere around the time of year 2000, before the GameCube controller. Many of you might look at this controller and think that it does look similar to the GameCube controller, and maybe you could get the concept of the design from the GameCube controller from this one itself. This is a Nintendo licensed controller. It does have the Nintendo 64 symbol up here, along with saying Hori. And on the back, in the middle here, it does say Nintendo 64, Hori Electronic Co. Limited, and then it says Horipad Mini 64 made in Japan. So this controller does work with the worldwide released N64 consoles. It works with every Nintendo 64 console. The port for the controller is just the same as any other Nintendo 64 controller. And on the port it does say Hori here, which is a little bit different than the other controllers. The price of this controller will cost you usually around $40 or more. If you find it for less, you are lucky. If you find it in the box, then it's even more expensive. And there were many different color variations, just like the regular Nintendo 64 controller. I have a black one here just to compare it to, so I'll bring that one down. So obviously the size comparison, the Hori Mini Pad is what it calls itself. It's very mini. The buttons appear the same or feel the same as the N64 buttons. They're very, very similar, except for the start button. Obviously the start button here is circular, it says start, and on the Horipad it's just a little rubber dot, and it feels kind of cheap. I don't really like the feel of it, but you don't press the start button that often anyways. The next thing to discuss is the joystick. The joystick on the N64 controllers are always problematic, and after time they eventually don't work very much, and they eventually just fall like this. And after Mario Party of twirling your hand around, it doesn't work very well anymore. I'm told that these last a lot longer. I haven't had this controller for that long, but in using it, it's much more responsive. Obviously it feels newer, and it is more difficult to use at first. When I was using it to play Ocarina of Time and I was trying to aim, because I'm so used to my own controller, which is probably a little loose, using this one I found it more responsive, so aiming was much more tedious to do. However, over time I assume that this will continue to work much more than this one will, as these wear out over a few months. The next thing is the Dpad. The Dpad on the N64 controller was nice and big. Obviously, as mentioned in a few other videos I think on the review of this controller, Nintendo thought that 3D gaming might fail, so that's why they had all three of these handles, for the option that if it did fail you could just use it like a simple controller if you just remove the middle basically. So in this controller they put a Dpad that's much smaller. It's about the same size as the GameCube D-pad. However, it is almost unusable. It's just so difficult. If you ever played a GameCube and tried to use a D-pad, it's a similar effect. It's almost in the same spot as well. So it's very difficult to use. Next is the shoulder buttons. The shoulder buttons on the Nintendo 64 controller were quite long, and on the Horipad they're actually just half the length of size. Sorry about that. So they're the top ones. This is the L button, and then the R button, obviously on the right hand side. The Z button on the underneath of the N64 controller has been moved to the top of these controllers, and you have the option to use either the left or the right. They're both the same button. I personally always use the left because the spacing here was much more easy to use than trying to hit the up C button as well as one of the triggers. Kind of just hurt my hand. So many people actually think that this joystick is the exact same as a GameCube controller. So I have my black GameCube controller here. And as you can tell, the GameCube controller, the joystick, is actually smaller than the Hori. If you ever had to replace the joystick on a Horipad, it is nearly impossible to do. It's very, very difficult. You can do it, but it's extremely difficult to open up and do. The Nintendo 64 joystick replacement is quite simple, and usually you can find a stick for $7 or $8. So replacement of those, you have to do over and over and over. So if you have to replace it, say, 3 times in its lifetime, you might as well have bought one of these, which you will be very unlikely to have to replace the joystick. So the D-pad of this one is more black, this one is gray. So to go over the entire review, the negatives was that it has a horrific D-pad, which is basically useless for 2D games such as Mischief Makers or Kirby. You might as well use that original N64 if you're playing 2D games, but for the other near 400 releases, you might as well use this controller here. It's too small for big hands. After playing for a while, I found that it actually can hurt my hands because It feels like they're a little cramped and they're a little too close together, but for someone with smaller hands this would be perfect. And even someone with medium-sized hands, I think the controller would be great. And the last negative is that it's a little pricey because it is $40 or a little bit more than that. So if you wanted a set of 4 of them, that is looking to be quite a bit of dollars. The positive is that it has a great analog stick that is supposed to last a long time. It has thoughtful design and support. It simply removes the useless third handle, and the longevity of this is supposed to last a lot longer than the other controller. So that is my review of the Hori Mini Pad. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I know this controller was released in at least another 10 colors, such as the blue that I have here. I have a red one on the way as well because I'm liking them so much. There was also a green, a gold, and then there was see-through lilac purple, a see-through blue, a see-through red, and I believe there was one more color, but I cannot think of it at this point. I think there was see-through white as well. There may have been a few more. So that's my review of the Hori Mini Pad controller. Definitely pick one up if you have the money.